She was the silent strength behind the man who changed the nation. Khadijeh Saqafi, the Grand Lady of Iran, never stood in the crowds. She never gave speeches. Her name echoed in the public. But while her husband stood at the center of history, she walked just a step behind through exile, grief, and revolution. But when she died, her children discovered a box, locked and heartbreakingly personal. So, what secret was inside the box she had kept beside her all through the years? Welcome back to Never-Ending Celebrities. Before the revolution, Iran was ruled by Mohammad Reza Shah, a king whose crown stood firm, not just through heritage, but with the backing of Western powers like the United States and Britain. After the 1953 coup that removed Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, the Shah didn't just return. He returned stronger, with more control than ever before. He promised to modernize the country, and on the surface, it looked like he was winning. The streets of Tehran were filled with cars, Western fashion was embraced, cinemas were opening, and foreign companies began to run businesses inside Iran. But beneath the shine, a storm was already brewing in the hearts of Iranians. While the elite thrived, ordinary people were being left behind. Farmers lost their land, religious scholars were silenced, and across the country, a quiet fear grew that their traditions were fading, that their culture, their soul, was slowly being erased. In the 1960s, the Shah introduced the White Revolution, a reform package that brought land redistribution, voting rights for women, and industrial growth. However, alongside these reforms came control and fear. Political voices were pushed out, and mosques were closely watched by the state. And in the holy city of one cleric finally stood up and spoke, Ruhollah Khomeini. He defied the Shah's vision, not with armies or violence, but with unshaken belief. Even after his arrest in 1963 and exile the following year, he didn't step back. Instead, his quiet resistance grew louder across borders. Still, through all of it, by his side, there was a woman history almost forgot. Her name was Khadijeh Saqafi. She was born in Tehran in 1913 into a life of wealth, tradition, and respect. Her father, Ayatollah Muhammad Saqafi, was a revered cleric, not known for power, but for wisdom and humility. Her grandfather, Mirza Abdul Fazl Tehrani, had been one of the most influential scholars in Tehran. Their home wasn't just rich in comforts, it was alive in ideas, books, and conversations where religion and education shared the same space. Khadijeh grew up in a world of comfort and refinement. She had private tutors, she learned French, and walked across polished wooden floors beneath glittering chandeliers. It was a life most girls could only dream of, and many believed she was destined for something grand. However, her future held something no one could have predicted. Like most girls from elite families, she pictured a life full of opportunity. Maybe she'd marry an academic, a diplomat, someone with status and modern ideas. Instead, she found herself walking toward a man with none of that, the kind of match she never imagined, but ultimately accepted with grace. In 1929, at just 16 years old, Khadijeh married Ruhollah Khomeini, a young scholar from who had no titles, no fortune, and no interest in luxury. Still, there was something in his eyes, stillness, discipline, and strength that made him impossible to dismiss. He offered no riches, but he offered a purpose. Some say she dreamed of him before they met and took it as a sign. Whether myth or memory, one thing is certain. She didn't fight the path. Even though it led away from comfort, she accepted it with a quiet grace. On the day she left Tehran for she cried softly in the back seat. The city she left behind wasn't just home, it was everything she'd known. Her husband saw her tears and simply told her to be patient. So she was. Even though she stepped into a life of dust instead of chandeliers, she didn't look back. She swept their tiny home, cooked humble meals, turned hardship into ritual. She gave up on luxury, but she never lost her determination. She stepped out of a world that promised her chandeliers and French novels into a life that offered no guarantees. Still, that path would shape the history of a nation. But what does it really mean to be the wife of a revolutionary? To raise children while following a man the world couldn't contain? These are the questions history rarely asks. Yet, Khadijeh Saqafi didn't just live the answers, she endured them. She built a calm life with Imam Khomeini, and together they raised 7 children, 3 daughters, and 4 sons. One of them, Ahmad Khomeini, would grow up to become a close advisor to his father and a key figure during the revolution. But before the titles, they were just children, dragged through exile, fear, and unfamiliar places. When Khomeini was exiled in 1964 to Turkey, everything unraveled in a single night. Within hours, she packed what little they had, gathered their children, and left the only home they knew. They had no plan, safety, or guarantees, but she had already decided. Wherever he went, she would follow. It was not out of duty, but out of unwavering belief. In Turkey, they lived under watchful eyes, in a country whose language they didn't speak and the food they didn't understand. It was isolation disguised as exile. Still, Khadijeh kept the family steady. Even when the silence around her grew loud, she never let herself fall apart. Her children didn't see fear because she refused to show it. Soon, they moved to Najaf, Iraq. It was one of the hardest chapters in their life. They stayed for 13 years in crumbling buildings, where the heat burned through the walls and nights offered no bed, just a rug on the floor. However, even in that exhaustion, Khadijeh never let the struggle show. She woke early, cooked, prayed, cleaned, and held her children as if they still lived in comfort. But their journey didn't end in Najaf. On October 6, 1978, they moved again, this time to Neauphle-le-Château, a quiet French village near Paris. The Western world media was like a circus. Cameras were flashing. Reporters were swarming every time Khomeini stepped outside. Inside the house, though, Khadijeh remained invisible. She tended to her family, guarded her final fragments of peace, and never stepped in front of the lens. She wasn't a speaker, a leader, or a headline, but she was the reason he could keep going. When the world tried to break him, she held the pieces no one could see. She bore the weight of uncertainty, motherhood, poverty, and isolation without ever asking to be known. And perhaps that is why her story matters most, because while everyone watched the revolution rise, they missed the woman who stood quietly at its center. But how long can a woman carry history on her shoulders before it starts to break her from within? By 1977, Khadijeh Saqafi had already followed her husband across countries, carried her children through exile, and watched the revolution begin to burn through Iran. But then the fire came home. Her son, Mustafa, died under mysterious circumstances in Najaf. The officials called it a heart attack. Other whispers in the streets said otherwise. The rumors of poisoning and suspicion of secret hands grew stronger. The truth was never proven, but to Khadijeh, it didn't matter. Her son was already gone. She didn't break, at least not where anyone could see. In the quiet of her home, behind drawn curtains, her grief was something sacred. Those who knew her said her eyes changed that year, and a heaviness settled in. As the revolution came in 1979, and the world turned to Imam Khomeini as a symbol of power, of defiance. But behind that towering figure was the woman he confided in, the one who could offer him stillness in chaos. In public, she stayed invisible. In private, she was his mirror, offering her thoughts, her advice. Her presence wasn't loud, but it was anchoring. Not many dared to question him, but she could, and he listened. Then came 1989. The man she had built her life around was gone. The one voice she had followed across exile and revolution was silenced forever. Still, she stayed composed, quietly mourning, until 6 years later in 1995, when Ahmad, her second son, also died. She faced another heartbreak, another farewell. Even so, she did not step into power. She never sought to shape Iran politically, not even when people called her the mother of the revolution. That title, for her, had nothing to do with politics. It came from her endurance, the unshakable grace she carried through every farewell. However, in 2009, her story reached the final chapter. Khadijeh Saqafi passed away, quietly, just as she lived. Her death didn't just mark the end of a life, but the closing of an era most people never fully saw. There was no grand farewell, only silence for a woman who stood behind one of the most powerful figures in modern history. She was laid to rest beside him without ever wanting the world to remember her. And for a while, the world moved on. She never told the world what it cost her, but 3 years after her death, her children found a small sealed box which was tucked away in the corner of her belongings. It had been untouched since the day she sealed it. At first, her children hesitated to open it. Maybe it was out of respect or fear. But in time, their curiosity whispered louder than silence, and they opened it. Inside that box, there was nothing political, manifestos, instruction, or hidden agendas. Instead, it held the most personal piece of a long life, the pair of baby clothes which were carefully folded. It seemed like they belonged to one of her sons. There was a faded photograph of Mustafa and Ahmad, of her sons she once carried through exile and heartbreak as fragments of memory. And among them, a letter from her husband. It was dated as 1933, written during his pilgrimage to Hajj. Her children expected a will or a family heirloom, but what they found, it brought them into tears. My beloved, ever since I was separated from my dear sweetheart and my pillar of confidence, I have always remembered you, and your beautiful face is etched in my heart. My darling, may Allah keep you safe and sound in His protection. I hope that you are healthy and happy. Although things may be a little unpleasant, I am getting along. And thank God, whatever has come about so far has been good, and I am now in beautiful Beirut. I truly wish you were here. The scenery of the city and the sea are so pleasant. Alas, my lovely darling is not here with me, so how enjoyable could the scene be? Lovingly yours. The world on the page relieved a young husband, full of tenderness and longing, writing to the woman he missed. The box didn't hold secrets of power. It held something far rarer. Proof that in the quietest corners of history, love still leaves its traces. Today, she is remembered as Quds Iran, the Grand Lady of Iran, not for what she said, but for all that she carried in silence. So, what do you believe? Was she just a wife in the shadows, or the invisible spine of Iran's most defining era? Let us know in the comments. And if this story touched your heart, don't miss our video on Iran's powerful former First Lady. Where is she now? Her journey will stay with you.